Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you again with our fourth and final video focusing in on topic 1.5, ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So previously we looked at in our past videos, how the Constitution came together. We looked at the structure of the Constitution in its original form, and then we looked at the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. In this one, we're going to be taking some of these important themes from the Constitution and then applying it into matters of policy. When we talk about policy, policy is basically how government gets things done. It's the actions of government. And policy is always designed to solve a problem. If there are, too many car accidents on the road, then policy would have to be used to try to, solve that problem. That might involve, lowering the speed limits, or it might involve, putting more reflectors on the road at night, or putting more highway patrol officers on the road. The idea being is that policy is created to try to solve problems. Now, when we look at the Constitution, there are a number of important themes that kind of define it, and that leads to debates in society, which leads to also debates on policy in terms of, how do you solve certain problems. One of the important debates that we see as a theme in our Constitution is balancing order with liberty. The idea of, the government providing security at the same time as protecting freedom. And that is a balancing act. If you have a tremendous amount of order and security, then you have little liberty and freedom. And conversely, if you have a lot of liberty and freedom, you have very little security and order. So the idea is, how do you balance those things, especially when problems in society creep up? And one great example of this debate of, order versus liberty focuses in on the response to the 9/11 attacks. Once again, of course, when terrorists from Al Qaeda will kill over 3,000 Americans in an act of just gruesome brutality, the government is not going to just simply say, well, that was just a weird occurrence and hopefully it never happens again. No, the government is going to be very active in creating policy to make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, when we talk about the 9/11 attacks, that is certainly a threat to our security. And if we have a threat to our security, that means we need to increase security. But how much do you increase security to protect people when we know that increasing security diminishes liberty and freedom? So, how far is too much in the name of security? How much is too much in the name of liberty? Well, one of the responses to the 9/11 attacks, of course, was the passage of the Patriot Act. What the Patriot Act is going to do is allow the federal government to have more authority to be able to have access to the information about the communication information of American citizens. And basically what it did was create the NSA, the National Security Agency, to have the authority to have access to what is known as metadata for American citizens. The idea being able to have access to who are you calling and communicating via email. If it's talking about phone calls, how long are those phone calls? So there's a lot more of that information that is out there, making it easier to have probable cause to be able to get a search warrant to search your actual emails and to actually listen in on your phone conversations. And so, the argument behind that is that the government needs to have access, needs to have that power to be able to identify and root out terrorists before they commit these brutal, harmful acts. However, on the flip side, the concern is that, okay, I understand that you want to, have more access to my private, personal communications information, but by doing so, you could argue that that would invade one's privacy. Does the government need to know all this information about me? And I know a common argument is that, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you have nothing to worry about. The government should be able to access your information. It's only people that are doing criminal activity should worry. Well, it's much more complex than that because, for everybody has things about themselves that, though they may not be criminal in nature, they don't want the rest of the world to know about them. They might be embarrassed, or they might be, concerned it could be used against them in some way. And so the idea being is that, are we opening up the ability of the government to have access to this information? But if we don't allow the government to do this, then are we just leaving America, unprotected and open to another horrific terrorist attack? Now, one aspect of this debate came to a head because of the actions of this man right here, Edward Snowden, who in 2013, who was a former, contractor working within the federal government. He had access to a lot of top secret classified information, and he believed that the federal government was abusing its authority under the Patriot Act and was getting access to too much personal information of Americans. And he started to leak classified documents showing the extent to which the federal government was having access to our private communication records. Now, Snowden argues that he did this as a whistleblower to point out what he would consider to be illegal or unconstitutional activity by the federal government. But for those that disagree with his actions, he was viewed as, well, a traitor for publicly leaking top secret information. The Obama administration, when this took place, will view him not so much as a whistleblower, but as a traitor, and will actually charge him with 3 different, crimes, including 2 violations of the Espionage Act. Since those charges came down, Snowden fled the country and has been hiding in Russia ever since. But we do look at these questions and debates. How far is too far in government authority in the name of security, or how much freedom should people have to the point where it does threaten our security? We do know that in 2015, following the official ending of the Patriot Act, we see it get renewed in what's called the USA Freedom Act, which keeps the core of the Patriot Act in place, but does create further limits on how far the NSA can go in terms of collecting information and the ability to actually zero in on the details of our communications. Now, another important debate that stems from themes of the Constitution is regarding federalism. The idea being is, we are operating on a system where there's multiple levels of sovereign governments. You've got a national government, a federal government, but you also have state governments. And the question becomes, how far is too far in terms of federal involvement in what would be assumed to be state issues, especially via, what is explained in the 10th Amendment, as we mentioned previously. And one great example of where there's, kind of a brushing up of federal authority versus state authority, and a question of, is the federal government intruding too much on the states, or is the federal government doing what it needs to do to protect the rights of all Americans, regardless of what state they live in? One interesting area to focus in on is public education. As we mentioned in the previous video, public education is a 10th Amendment power that the states enjoy. There is no national curriculum. There is no, national education system. Yes, there's a National Department of Education, but what folks experience in public schools, that's really the result of what is being decided upon on a state-by-state basis. And yes, there are local school districts, but those local school districts exist at the pleasure of the state government. So a state can rearrange local governments however they want. Now note, states have that constitutional authority to direct public education, but the federal government does have an obligation to make sure that folks are treated equally under the law. For example, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So if the state is using its 10th Amendment authority to deny equal protection under the law in public education, then the federal government has, concerns about that. So, what do you do in these situations? And one of these examples of state authority coming into conflict with the federal government's, responsibility to protect people equal under the law dealt with segregation policies. We know that the South had maintained Jim Crow style segregation up until the 1950s and early 60s. And you saw the federal government intervene to stop that in public education. We saw that done with the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education, and then we see the executive branch enforce that ruling in 1957's Little Rock 9 situation, where President Eisenhower uses the 101st Airborne to enforce the integration of Little Rock Central High School. Now, once we get, past the mid-1960s, we see a lot of debate regarding federalism in public schools, not so much in terms of, segregation, but really in terms of funding and just overall federal authority in terms of curriculum development in public education. As we start to get into the 1960s, we see a major shift in the funding of public education through what's going to be called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This is going to create a major increase in funding for public schools from the federal government. Now, note, the federal government cannot just intervene and just dictate what states can do. However, the federal government can provide money to the states. And what the federal government almost always does with this federal money is provide the money with strings attached. So the idea being is that since we know states are always hard up for money, and states are always, looking to get more funding, states would inevitably take federal money because they needed the money, but that then in turn would allow the federal government to have more authority because they're the ones providing the money. And so you start to see, starting in the 1960s, about 10% of all funding for public schools now coming from the federal government, which is a decent little chunk. And as we go through the 70s and 80s and 90s, there's going to be more and more of a push from the federal government to improve the quality of public education and dangling federal dollars to make sure that that happens. One example of this that is going to be pretty significant is the No Child Left Behind Act that was passed during the administration of George W. Bush. This is going to start to actually require states to have mandatory standardized testing in various subject areas to see, academic growth in students. And that was tied to federal funding. So the idea being is if you want federal funding from the government for schools, then you need to go through these protocols. States don't like that because states want to run their own school the way they want, but they also need the money. So there becomes, a little bit of a question. We have seen No Child Left Behind be modified and changed depending on, the future administrations. You've seen the Obama administration really try to increase federal authority on the states with the Race to the Top initiative, which really attempted to create a de facto national curriculum. But there was a tremendous amount of pushback from the states, and it does show to some degree to what level the state will eventually say, hey, we don't need the money that badly. But we have seen Race to the Top replaced with ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. And bottom line, what you need to understand is that when you talk about, funding and curriculum in public schools, there is this kind of question. The states have the authority, but the federal government provides a decent chunk of that money. And if the federal government can provide money, shouldn't they be able to have a certain amount of control over how that money is being spent? If, for example, the federal government says, hey, here's money to, provide computers for all students, a state, would want the money, but they may bristle at the idea of having to spend it in that way if they don't feel it's in line with what they need for public education. At the same time, though, the federal government is concerned that, hey, what if a state is not using their funds responsibly to meet the needs of students? And if the federal government thinks that one of those important needs for a modern student is access to a laptop computer, then the federal government's concerned about making sure that every child has that opportunity. So that's where we get into this interesting balancing act between federal authority and state authority when it comes to matters of 10th Amendment policy, such as the public education. So some interesting debates for sure. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.